In recent weeks, the Caribbean Sea has quietly become a focal point of rising global tension. Oil tankers have been intercepted, shipping routes disrupted, and diplomatic warnings exchanged among major powers. At the center of this unfolding situation is Venezuela, a country already under heavy economic pressure, now facing an intensified U.S. campaign targeting its oil exports. As Washington escalates enforcement actions, China and Russia have stepped in diplomatically, warning of broader consequences for international trade and maritime law. This video explains how Venezuela's oil sector became the latest front in a global power struggle, why tanker seizures matter far beyond Latin America, and what this standoff reveals about sanctions, energy security, and shifting geopolitical alliances. The United States has significantly expanded its actions against Venezuela's oil trade, introducing what officials have described as a blockade of tankers transporting sanctioned crude. This policy aims to restrict Venezuela's ability to sell oil internationally, a crucial source of revenue for the government led by President Nicolas Maduro. The move follows years of U.S. sanctions imposed over allegations of democratic backsliding, corruption, and links to illicit activities. Since the announcement, activity at Venezuela's major ports has slowed noticeably. According to shipping data reported by Reuters, tanker loading has declined, and vessels that are already loaded have increasingly remained anchored rather than departing for international destinations. Millions of barrels of oil are now sitting idle aboard ships as buyers hesitate or demand deeper discounts to offset the legal and logistical risks of transporting Venezuelan crude. This slowdown is particularly significant because oil accounts for roughly 95% of Venezuela's export earnings. Any disruption to this flow further strains an economy that has already contracted by more than 70% since 2013, one of the steepest peacetime economic declines in modern history. U.S. forces have intercepted multiple vessels in recent weeks, including tankers allegedly linked to what Washington describes as Venezuela's shadow fleet. These are ships accused of using deceptive practices such as altering names, switching flags, or disabling tracking systems to evade sanctions enforcement. One such vessel, reportedly bound for China, was seized despite not being formally listed under U.S. sanctions at the time. This detail has fueled international criticism, particularly from countries that argue such actions blur the line between sanctions enforcement and violations of international maritime law. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, ships operating in international waters are subject primarily to the jurisdiction of their flag state. The interception of tankers without multilateral authorization raises complex legal questions, especially when vessels are not directly sanctioned. China has emerged as Venezuela's most important oil customer, purchasing an estimated 4% of its total crude imports from the South American country. Much of this oil is sold at discounted rates, reflecting the risks associated with sanctions and transport. Beijing has strongly criticized the interception of oil tankers, framing it as a violation of international law and a threat to global shipping norms. Chinese officials have reiterated that Venezuela has the right to maintain economic relations with other nations and that unilateral sanctions undermine global trade stability. China's position is shaped not only by principle but also by energy security. As the world's largest oil importer, China relies on diversified supply chains. Disruptions in one region can ripple across global markets, especially at a time when geopolitical tensions have already reshaped energy flows due to the war in Ukraine and sanctions on Russia and Iran. Russia has also voiced strong opposition to U.S. actions in the Caribbean, warning that escalating enforcement could endanger international shipping and regional stability. Russian officials have emphasized solidarity with Venezuela's leadership, framing the situation as part of a broader pattern of Western pressure on governments outside U.S. influence. Moscow's support is both ideological and strategic. As a heavily sanctioned energy exporter itself, Russia has a vested interest in challenging the expansion of US-led sanctions enforcement. Russian oil exports increasingly rely on alternative shipping networks and non-Western buyers, making the precedent set in Venezuela particularly concerning from Moscow's perspective. The alignment between Russia and Venezuela also reflects deeper ties in military cooperation, energy investment, and diplomatic coordination at international forums. The standoff has raised alarm within the maritime industry. Shipping analysts warn that increased interceptions and enforcement actions could push more vessels into regulatory gray zones. Tankers may avoid established routes, operate without proper insurance, or engage in risky ship-to-ship transfers to obscure cargo origins. According to industry estimates, accidents involving uninsured or poorly maintained tankers can result in cleanup costs exceeding $1 billion per incident. Environmental risks are especially high in congested waterways like the Caribbean, where spills could devastate fisheries and tourism-dependent economies. Insurance providers have already begun reassessing coverage for voyages near Venezuelan waters, further increasing transport costs and reducing the pool of willing carriers. Caracas views the intensified U.S. actions as an attempt to force political change rather than a narrow sanctions enforcement effort. Venezuelan officials have accused Washington of acting outside international norms and undermining the country's sovereignty. From Venezuela's perspective, the targeting of tankers, combined with military-style interdictions and earlier maritime strikes, signals a broader strategy aimed at weakening the government's financial base. These fears are reinforced by the timing of the actions, which come amid stalled negotiations between the government and opposition groups over electoral reforms. Washington maintains that Venezuela's oil revenues are being used to support criminal networks and destabilizing activities across the region. U.S. officials have linked enforcement actions to broader anti-narcotics operations in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, citing concerns over trafficking routes. However, independent verification of these claims remains limited, and several regional governments have raised concerns about civilian casualties and the impact on local fishing communities. Families and officials in affected areas have disputed U.S. characterizations of some maritime targets. This confrontation is unfolding against a backdrop of expanding global sanctions. Since 2022, Western governments have imposed record levels of restrictions on energy exports from Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. These measures have reshaped oil markets, encouraged the growth of alternative shipping networks, and increased reliance on non-Western trade corridors. The Venezuelan case highlights the limits of unilateral enforcement in an increasingly multipolar world. While the US retains unmatched naval capabilities, resistance from major powers like China and Russia complicates efforts to isolate sanctioned states completely. Brussels and Washington have hoped that strict enforcement would deter shadow shipping practices globally. Instead, analysts note that such pressure often accelerates the creation of parallel systems that are harder to regulate and monitor. What is happening off Venezuela's coast is not just about one country's oil exports. It reflects deeper shifts in how power, trade, and law interact in today's global system. As sanctions expand and enforcement becomes more assertive, the risk of miscalculation grows. For global markets, the immediate concern is supply disruption and price volatility. For international law, the challenge lies in preserving shared rules governing the seas. And for geopolitics, the episode underscores how energy has once again become a central tool of influence and confrontation. As the situation continues to evolve, the question is no longer only whether Venezuela can sell its oil, but whether the global system can manage rising tensions without further destabilizing already fragile trade networks.